What if I told you that behind the gilded thrones and jeweled crowns of history, there were women whose cruelty rivaled the most infamous tyrants the world has ever known? Not fairy tale queens, but real rulers, calculated, merciless, and terrifying. These were women who bathed in blood, ruled through fear, and carved their names into history with the edge of a blade. From the mountains of Madagascar to the imperial palaces of China, their reigns were soaked in betrayal, paranoia, and death. These are not your Disney queensies, are the most evil queens in history, and their stories will chill you to the bone. They called her the Mad Queen of Madagascar, a ruler so feared, so merciless, and so unapologetically cruel, that her name still sends shivers down the spines of historians more than a century later. While many queens have been ruthless, cunning, or even bloodthirsty, none have matched the raw brutality of Queen Ranavalona I. Her 3-decade reign turned the island of Madagascar into a graveyard soaked in paranoia, religious persecution, and death. And the most chilling part? She believed she was doing the right thing. Born in 1778 as the daughter of a commoner, Ranavalona's life could have faded into obscurity, but fate had other plans. Her father once uncovered a conspiracy against the king and, as a reward, was adopted into the royal family. This act of loyalty gave Ranavalona access to a world of power that someone of her status could only dream of. She later married Prince Radama, the heir to the throne. When he became King Radama I, Ranavalona became queen. But she was just one of his many wives, and she knew that if she didn't act decisively, she'd be swept aside like so many others. When Radama died in 1828, there was no clear heir. The kingdom teetered on the edge of chaos. That's when Ranavalona made her move. With the help of loyal palace guards and a few cunning military commanders, she seized the throne, declaring herself Queen of the Marina Kingdom. Almost immediately, she began a bloody purge. Anyone who posed a threat, anyone who questioned her claim to power was executed. Nobles, advisors, even members of the royal family were dragged from their homes, and by the time the dust settled, Ranavalona stood alone at the top, ruling not just as a queen, but as a godlike figure. At first, her subjects hoped she might rule with wisdom. That hope quickly dissolved into fear. Ranavalona was obsessed with preserving the traditions of her ancestors. She saw European influence, especially Christianity, as a poison that threatened the soul of Madagascar. While her late husband had welcomed European missionaries, Ranavalona shut the door on all things foreign. She banned Christian teachings. She expelled foreign missionaries. And most horrifying of all, she unleashed a wave of religious persecution that would drown her kingdom in blood. Christian converts, many of them poor farmers and children, were arrested, tortured, and killed in some of the most gruesome ways imaginable. They were forced to drink poison as a test of faith. Some were tied up in pigskin bags and thrown off cliffs. Others were burned alive. Entire villages were wiped out. And yet, under this blanket of terror, the Christian faith didn't die. It simply went underground, and that made Ranavalona even more paranoid. But her brutality didn't end with religion. She imposed her will with medieval cruelty. One of her most infamous policies was the use of trial by ordeal, known as the If someone was accused of a crime, whether theft, treason, or practicing Christianity, if they vomited all 3 pieces, they were innocent. If not, they were guilty and executed on the spot. It didn't matter if they actually committed the crime. The poison killed thousands. At its peak, over 3,000 people a year died from this trial alone. Even by the standards of the 19th century, this was barbaric. Ranavalona's reign of terror wasn't just spiritual, it was physical. She had no patience for dissent. Anyone who questioned her rule faced execution, or worse. Her labor policies were equally deadly. To strengthen her kingdom and protect it from European powers, she launched massive construction projects, especially military roads meant to connect the island's distant provinces. On the surface, this seemed like smart state, but the execution was horrifying. Tens of thousands of commoners were conscripted into forced labor. They were marched hundreds of miles on foot, poorly fed, underarmed, and constantly abused. Disease, starvation, and exhaustion claimed their lives by the thousands. Some never returned home. For every mile of road laid, a trail of corpses was left behind. Even her closest advisors began to question the cost. But Ranavalona didn't care. To her, these sacrifices were necessary for the preservation of her kingdom. Foreign governments grew increasingly frustrated. British and French envoys, once welcomed during Radama's rule, were now treated with suspicion or outright hostility. On one occasion, she ordered the massacre of hundreds of foreign soldiers who had tried to land on her shores. Letters from diplomats described her court as a place of fear and superstition, where even whispering the wrong word could lead to death. She even toyed with foreign engineers, inviting them to build weapons and fortresses, then imprisoning them once their work was done. Madness? Maybe. Or maybe just cold political calculation. And yet, despite the death, despite the suffering, she held on to power. For 33 years, Ranavalona ruled Madagascar with absolute authority. She crushed rebellions, assassinated rivals, and survived multiple assassination attempts. Her people feared her more than they feared God, and that fear kept her throne warm. Strangely, there were moments of brilliance in her reign. Her resistance to European colonization delayed the fall of Madagascar for decades. Her preservation of native traditions kept her culture intact when so many others were swallowed by European empires. Some historians argue that she was simply doing what she thought necessary to protect her people, but even that defense has its limits. A protector doesn't murder tens of thousands of her own citizens. A wise queen doesn't purge the innocent in the name of purity. By the time she died peacefully in her bed in 1861, her kingdom was exhausted. The fields were empty, the villages quiet, and the people broken. Her son, who succeeded her, immediately reversed many of her policies, welcoming back missionaries and ending the worst of the brutality. But the scars she left would never fade. To this day, in Madagascar, her name is spoken with a strange mix of horror and awe. Some remember her as a patriot, others as a monster. Perhaps she was both. History often softens its villains with time, but Queen Ranavalona I remains an exception. Her story is a reminder of what happens when absolute power meets unchecked paranoia, when tradition becomes a weapon, and when a leader believes that fear is the only path to loyalty. She may not have conquered continents, but in the halls of evil rulers, her throne stands tall. 2. Elizabeth Báthory. In the quiet hills of 17th century Hungary, a legend was born, one drenched not in glory, but in blood. Her name was Elizabeth, and behind the cold stone walls of her castle, she earned a reputation so terrifying, so brutal, that even centuries later, she's remembered as one of history's most sadistic killers. Some say she bathed in the blood of virgins to preserve her youth. Others claim she tortured and murdered hundreds of young girls just to hear them scream. Whether truth or myth, the story of the Blood Countess is as chilling as it is unforgettable. Elizabeth was born in 1560 into one of the most powerful noble families in Hungary. She was wealthy, educated, and stunningly beautiful. Her family line included kings, warlords, and bishops. But they also had a history of mental illness, cruelty, and political scheming. From a young age, Elizabeth was exposed to violence. She witnessed the brutal punishments of peasants. She learned about the dark arts, and may have even participated in early acts of cruelty. To the outside world, she was a refined, noble woman. But behind her perfect manners was something far more sinister. At 15, Elizabeth was married to Count Florence, a warrior known as the Black Knight of Hungary for his cruelty on the battlefield. The marriage was arranged for political reasons, but it also gave Elizabeth a private fortress-like castle perched atop a lonely hill, far from prying eyes. Her husband was often away fighting the Ottomans, and while he was gone, Elizabeth was left in charge. That's when the horror truly began. What started as petty cruelty soon escalated into monstrous torture. Servants and peasant girls were lured into the castle under the promise of work. Once inside, they disappeared. According to witness accounts, Elizabeth would strike girls with red-hot pokers, stab them with needles, cut off fingers, and even so, their mouths shut. She starved some, burned others, and reportedly forced victims to eat their own flesh. The screams of tortured girls echoed through the castle halls, but no one dared speak out because Elizabeth was a noble, and her victims were poor. But perhaps the most horrifying rumor was this. Elizabeth allegedly bathed in their blood, believing it would keep her young and beautiful forever. It was said she would stand nude as servants drained the blood from virgins, catching it in a basin, then smearing it across her skin like a grotesque lotion. There's little concrete evidence for this particular claim, and some historians argue it was added later to amplify the horror. But in the minds of many, it's become inseparable from her legend. Over the years, the body count grew. Some say 36 victims, others say over 300. A servant girl once escaped the castle and ran screaming through the village, showing wounds and burn marks. That's when whispers became accusations. Local clergy began to suspect something foul was happening behind the castle gates. But still Elizabeth was untouchable. She was nobility in that era rarely faced justice, no matter how heinous their crimes. Eventually, however, the sheer number of disappearances became impossible to ignore. In 1610, King Matthias II of Hungary sent his trusted advisor, Georgi, to investigate. What he found shocked even the most hardened soldiers. Inside the castle, they discovered mutilated bodies, blood-soaked walls, and living girls chained to the walls, barely breathing, their bodies ravaged by torture. Elizabeth was arrested on the spot, along with 4 of her closest servants, who were accused of helping her commit the crimes. During the trial, hundreds of witnesses testified. They spoke of beatings, of iron spikes, of starvation, of girls being buried alive or frozen to death. One servant confessed that they kept a tally of victims, and the number reached 650. That number, written in Elizabeth's own handwriting in a private journal, became the stuff of legend. The servants were sentenced to death, some burned alive, others beheaded. But Elizabeth herself, she was too powerful to execute. Instead, she was sealed inside her castle tower, her windows bricked up, her doors locked, her world reduced to darkness and silence. For the next 4 years she lived in isolation, fed through a small hole in the wall, no sunlight, no visitors. Just the ghosts of her victims, real or imagined, whispering in the night. In 1614, she was found dead on the floor. No one mourned her. No one wept. She was buried in secret, her grave unmarked, forever erased from history, or so they hoped. But Elizabeth never truly disappeared. Her story became folklore, then myth, then horror, fiction. She inspired vampire legends across Europe. Some believe Bram Stoker used her as a prototype for Count Dracula. Her name appears in countless books, films, and even metal songs. She is the blueprint for the beautiful monster, the elegant killer, who hides a bloodlust beneath a porcelain smile. Yet, modern historians still debate the truth of her crimes. Some argue that Elizabeth was the victim of a political conspiracy, that jealous nobles and a greedy king fabricated the charges to seize her land and wealth. After all, she was a powerful woman in a world ruled by men, a widow with more influence than most male nobles. Could she have been framed? The evidence is mixed. The testimonies were gathered under torture, and no formal record of the supposed diary listing 650 victims has ever been found. But the physical remains, the eyewitnesses, and the blood-stained horror discovered in her castle all point to something truly dark. Even if the number was exaggerated, even if the bath of blood was a myth, Elizabeth remains one of the most terrifying women to ever walk the earth. She reminds us that monsters don't always wear masks. Sometimes they wear jewels and silk. Sometimes they speak with grace and host grand banquets. Sometimes evil lives in the castle, on the hill, smiling politely as girls go in and never come out. Whether guilty or framed, Elizabeth's legacy is soaked in fear, and her name forever etched into the history books as the Blood Countess, a queen of horror in her own right. 3. In a world where women were expected to be silent, obedient, and invisible, Wuzi did something unthinkable. She didn't just rule. She dominated. She climbed her way from the lowest ranks of concubinage to the absolute pinnacle of Chinese imperial power, becoming the only woman to ever rule China in her own name as emperor. But her rise was not paved with diplomacy or charm. It was drenched in intrigue, manipulation, and death. Her enemies called her a monster. Her supporters hailed her as a visionary, and history still can't decide which version is true. Wu Zishan was born in 624 AD to a relatively wealthy family during the Tang dynasty. Her father was a lumber merchant, but unlike many girls of the time, Wu was educated. She read literature, studied politics, and even learned military strategy. From a young age, she was clever, brilliant, but, more importantly, she was ambitious. At just 14, she was selected as a concubine to Emperor Taizong, one of China's most powerful rulers. But with dozens of women in the palace, Wu was barely a shadow in the background. For years, she waited, watched, and learned. When the emperor died, custom dictated that concubines like her, those without children, be sent to a Buddhist convent to live out the rest of their days in silence. But Wu refused to fade. Instead, she seduced Emperor Gaozong, Taizong's son, and returned to the palace as his favorite consort. That was her first masterstroke, the beginning of one of the most ruthless political ascents in history. Wu began removing her rivals one by one. According to some records, she even murdered her own newborn daughter, then framed the emperor's wife for the crime. The empress was dethroned, and Wu took her place. Whether or not this gruesome tale is true, the result was the same. Wu became Empress of China, and that title gave her more than power. It gave her access to everything. When Emperor Gaozong fell ill, Wu became the de facto ruler of the empire. She sat behind a silk screen and issued commands in his name. Ministers who disagreed with her found themselves demoted, exiled, or mysteriously dead. She built a vast network of informants. No one could speak against her without risk. She created a secret police force that rooted out dissent and silenced critics, often with torture or execution. Her court became a place of whispered terror where a single word could mean death. Then, in 690 AD, she did the unthinkable. Wu Zishan declared herself Emperor of China, not Empress Consort, not regent, but Emperor, a title no woman before her had ever dared to claim. She founded a new dynasty, Zhou dynasty, breaking from the Temps bloodline and cementing her rule as absolute. The backlash was immediate. Scholars, Confucianists, and rival nobles were outraged. They believed a woman ruling as emperor was an abomination. Wu's response silenced them all. She launched brutal purges, exterminating entire families of perceived traitors. Even loyal ministers were not safe. She employed ruthless tactics to maintain control: public executions, false confessions, even the desecration of ancestral tombs. Her rule became synonymous with fear. Yet through all the horror, she kept the country running. She was not a mad queen burning her empire to the ground. On the contrary, China thrived under her leadership. Wu expanded the civil service examination system, making it possible for talented people, regardless of background, to serve in government. She promoted agricultural reforms, lowered taxes, and oversaw flourishing of art, culture, and education. Under her, China remained stable and wealthy. It was a strange paradox. Her methods were violent and cold, but her results were effective and progressive. She also understood the power of image. Wu declared herself the incarnation of the Maitreya Buddha, portraying her rule as divinely ordained. She commissioned towering Buddhist statues and grand temples that symbolized her legitimacy. Propaganda was everywhere: coins, sculptures, even altered historical records. She wasn't just ruling China, she was rewriting it in her own image. But even empires built on steel and cunning cannot last forever. As Wu aged, palace intrigue grew. Younger concubines, scheming officials, and even her own children plotted behind her back. Her later years were filled with paranoia and betrayal. She installed lovers half her age as ministers, provoking scandal. Eventually, a coalition of officials and family members forced her to abdicate. In 705 AD, a few months later, she died quietly in the palace she once commanded with iron will. After her death, the Temps dynasty was restored, and official histories painted her as a Shidavella usurper, a murderer, a tyrant. Confucian scholars described her reign as a dark period of chaos, claiming she reversed the natural order by placing a woman on the throne. Her name was buried, her dynasty erased. But over time, the story began to change. Modern historians have started to re-evaluate Wu Zixia not as a villain, but as a political genius, who played by the rules of her time. And in those rules, brutality was the currency of power used, not only by Wu, but by countless male emperors before and after her. Her difference? She succeeded. She ruled a vast empire as a woman, in an age that considered that impossible, and she left it stronger than she found it. Was Wu Zixia evil? That depends on how you define evil. She killed, certainly. She silenced her enemies, yes. But she also governed wisely, rewarded merit, and defended her nation's interests with unmatched brilliance. In a time when women had no voice, she claimed the loudest one in the empire. Perhaps what terrified her critics most wasn't her cruelty, but her tomb remains sealed to this day. Beneath a stone, steely, deliberately left blank. No name, no inscription. Just a monument to a ruler who defied every expectation and changed the course of Chinese history forever. In the end, Wu Zixia remains one of the most polarizing figures in history. A ruler draped in contradictions. A woman who shattered the ceiling of an empire and paid for it with a legacy soaked in blood and brilliance. Her story isn't just about power. It's about what a woman had to become to survive in a world that never wanted her to rule. 4. Bloody Mary. She was born a princess destined for greatness, draped in silks, and surrounded by servants. But by the time she took the throne, Mary Tudor, the first Queen Regnant of England, had already lived a life of betrayal, heartbreak, and humiliation. And when she finally held the crown, she ruled not with mercy or joy but with fire and blood. Today, the world remembers her by a name, whispered with dread: Bloody Mary. To understand how Mary became one of the most feared monarchs in English history, you have to begin at her roots. She was the daughter of King Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, a child of powerful dynasties. Her early years were filled with the trappings of royalty, lavish palaces, private tutors, and endless praise. But that dream life shattered when Mary was just a teenager. Her father, obsessed with producing a male heir, cast aside her mother in favor of the seductive and ambitious Anne Boleyn. Overnight, Mary went from a celebrated princess to a declared illegitimate bastard. She was stripped of her title, her household disbanded, and she was forced to serve in the court of her infant half-sister Elizabeth Anne Boleyn's daughter. Her mother died, heartbroken, in exile. Mary, once the pride of the kingdom, now lived in humiliation. For the rest of her father's life, and under the rule of her Protestant half-brother Edward, the sixth Mary was kept in the shadows. She was Catholic in a country rapidly swinging Protestant, and she refused to abandon her faith. She endured pressure, threats, and isolation. She watched as the England she knew transformed into something else. But she never wavered, not in belief, not in pride, not in her right to rule. Then, in 1553, everything changed. Edward VI died young, and Protestant leaders tried to install Lady Jane Grey, a Protestant cousin, as queen. But they underestimated Mary's resolve. Backed by nobles, soldiers, and thousands of ordinary citizens, Mary launched a swift and bloodless coup. She rode into London victorious, greeted by cheering crowds. For the first time in English history, a woman ruled in her own right. At first, her reign was hopeful. She promised tolerance and peace. The people, weary from religious chaos, welcomed a return to tradition. But Mary was not just interested in governance. She was on a mission. She saw herself as a divine instrument, sent to restore the true faith. Protestantism to her was a plague, and she believed her soul in, the soul of England, depended on eradicating it. That's when the fires began. Within a year, Mary reinstated Catholic law. She repealed her brother's reforms and invited Cardinal Reginald Pole back from exile to re-establish ties with Rome. Protestants were given a chance to recant, but those who refused were branded heretics. Between 1555 and 1558, over 280 men and women were burned at the stake. These weren't shadowy executions in the night. They were public spectacles to terrify and purge. Farmers, blacksmiths, ministers, widow savants, pregnant women were tied to wooden posts and set ablaze. Their screams echoed across town squares, the air filled with the stench of burning flesh. Entire families watched loved ones burn for the crime of holding a Bible in English or refusing the Pope's authority. And Mary didn't flinch. She believed it was holy work, that each flame cleansed the nation's sin. Some of the victims became martyrs. Names like Thomas Cranmer, Hugh Latimer, and Nicholas Ridley, once powerful bishops, were reduced to ash. But their courage inspired future generations. Protestants fled in droves, escaping to Germany and Switzerland, but many could not leave, and they paid the price with fire. Mary's brutal religious purge earned her the title that would outlive her legacy, Bloody Mary. But her reign was not defined by fire alone. She made another fateful decision, one that would erode her support and deepen her sorrow. She married Philip II of Spain. It was a political alliance meant to strengthen Catholic Europe, but the English people despised Philip. They saw him as a foreign invader, a symbol of Spanish dominance. When he arrived in England, he barely spoke the language, rarely smiled, and treated Mary coldly, but Mary loved him with a desperate passion. She believed he would give her the child she needed to secure her Catholic dynasty. And for a time, it seemed her prayers were answered. Mary announced a pregnancy. Her belly swelled. She withdrew from public view to await the birth of her heir. England waited, to some with joy, others with dread, but the child never came. Months passed, and Mary's body returned to its normal shape. It had all been a phantom pregnancy, likely the result of intense psychological stress, or worse, a tumor. The humiliation was unbearable. Whispers filled the court. Philip left England soon after, more interested in his wars than his wife. Mary would suffer a second false pregnancy years later. Again, no child, no heir, no legacy, alone, unloved, and surrounded by flames. Mary's health began to fail. She became withdrawn, her body weakened by stress and illness. Her once hopeful reign had collapsed into despair. The people grew restless. The same crowds that had cheered her ascension now prayed for her death. In 1558, at the age of 42, Mary died. Her last words, reportedly, were Philip's name. She left no child, no dynasty, and no redemption. Her throne passed to her sister Elizabeth, a Protestant, who would reverse Mary's religious policies and usher in an era of relative peace and prosperity. History was not kind to Mary. She was buried without ceremony, her name forever attached to fire and terror. But beneath the ashes, there is another layer to her story. Mary was a woman forged in betrayal, a child robbed of her mother, her title, her dignity. She spent her life fighting to reclaim what was taken, to prove her worth in a world that dismissed her gender and her faith. Her cruelty was real, her violence, unforgivable, but her pain, that too was real. Her reign is not just the story of a tyrant. It is the story of a broken soul who tried to save a kingdom and, instead, set it ablaze. Perhaps that's why her ghost still lingers, not just in haunted mirrors and children's games, but in the dark corridors of history. A queen who ruled with fire, but whose heart burned even brighter with sorrow.